Hello, welcome to People and Profit and this week's special show focusing on the economies of Latin America. Coming up, Venezuela faces fresh sanctions on its crucial oil industry, while the economy plunges into still more uncertainty. Nearly a month after millions of Mexicans got a pay raise, our correspondents find out what impact the minimum wage hike is really having. And is it the new great game? We head to Bolivia, where untapped reserves of lithium could power the country into a new future. The United States has imposed new sanctions on Venezuela's state-run oil giant, an effort to add pressure to the industry and Nicolas Maduro. But despite its huge potential and membership in OPEC, Venezuela's oil sector remains underdeveloped. Last year, its output was less than half of pumping levels a decade earlier. The resources could be leveraged to help ease the staggering economic and humanitarian catastrophe, but decades of mismanagement mean the road ahead is a rocky one, and Venezuela's future remains uncertain.
Long queues at the pump in Venezuela. A gas shortage is one of the many crises to hit the nation, despite its famous oil reserves. Venezuela has more oil than any other country in the world, with an estimated 300 billion barrels. But it's struggling to produce it. In 2008, Venezuela was pumping 3.2 million barrels a day. 10 years later, in 2018, just 1.5 million. That's barely more than in the 1950s. But Venezuela's biggest paradox may be that it exports its oil, notably to be refined in Texas and Louisiana, before buying it back in the form of petrol.
It's a huge loss for the Venezuelan state and for the national company to export petrol, pay for it to be refined and buy it for itself. It's a situation that's absurd and paradoxical.
That's because Venezuela can no longer refine its own oil. The infrastructure is outdated with recurring leaks. At times, refineries have been known to explode. It all started during the Chavez era.
Socialismo o muerte, lo juro.
After becoming president in 1998, Chavez took over the public oil company. He fired 20,000 qualified workers and replaced them with loyal militants. He stopped investing and redistributed oil profits through social programs. But massive corruption caused the disappearance of hundreds of millions of euros. The sector continued to suffer under Nicolas Maduro, contributing to the broader economic catastrophe.
Now for more, let's turn to Diego Moya Ocampos, Latin America specialist at IHS Markit. Diego, thanks for being with us on People and Profit. How damaging will this latest round of U.S. sanctions be for Venezuela?
Well, definitely these sanctions are a game changer. Venezuela's main source of revenue is the oil sector, and certainly PDVSA not being allowed to access the proceeds from sales will definitely put the country in a very difficult situation, or may I say, Maduro's administration. And we have to say that this comes at a time when we expect the economy to contract at least 15%, inflation already the highest in the world, severe shortages of food and basic goods, a collapse of the electricity grid, of water supplies infrastructure, of natural gas, which is what most Venezuelans use for cooking. So certainly sanctions at this moment could be a game changer as the people in the streets are demanding.
Now, the oil industry is far from the strongest that it could be. Could the industry recover enough to help get the broader economy back on track? And if so, how? Absolutely.
The key thing is first to have a transition towards democracy. Second, to have an administration different than the one of Maduro, which has failed dramatically to attract foreign direct investment. We have to remember that Venezuela is in its current dire state because, or as a result of, widespread corruption and epic mismanagement within the oil sectors.
Now, we hear a lot about hyperinflation in Venezuela, the IMF forecasting it to hit 10 million% this year. Concretely, what do those numbers really mean?
What this means on the ground is that money means nothing, that workers' purchasing capacity has absolutely disappeared. What this means is very severe shortages of food and basic goods, including medicines, a collapse of the health system. What it means is that the children and the elderly are dying of starvation, of lacks of medicines. It's a political, social, and economic crisis turned into a full-blown humanitarian crisis, one which is certainly unprecedented in the Latin American region and which has forced at least 10% of the population to move to Colombia and other border areas. 3 million, according to United Nations, have fled the country.
Now, a lot of people blame this economic crisis, including these shortages of food and medicine, squarely on Nicolas Maduro and his policies. Is it really as simple as that, or are there other factors at play here?
I think late President Hugo Chavez is also to blame for this disaster. We have to remember that in mid-2014, oil prices sharply declined. But way before, back in Chavez time, the economy was already in contraction. Shortages of food and basic goods were already an issue, obviously not as bad as they are at the moment.
Now, the U.S. is obviously still a very major player in the region, but Caracas has very strong economic ties to Russia and China. What kind of influence do they have?
They have a significant influence, certainly. China and Russia are Venezuela's lenders of last resort, or shall I say, Maduro's lenders of last resort. Now, when it comes to China, I think the Chinese already made their mind. Since the last 3 years, we haven't seen the Chinese granting any new allocation of funding for the Venezuelans. The Russians play a different game. The Russians are there playing a sort of geopolitical game, trying to provoke the US. But Russia, being a country with an economy the size of Spain, is in no position to allocate the necessary funds for Venezuela to prevent a contraction of 15%. We are not likely to expect fresh cash to sort of like save Maduro from falling down.
All right, Diego Moya Ocampos of IHS, thanks so much for your insight.